The midnight visits of the children who never left. My son looks outside the window every day at 12 a.m. Exactly 5 minutes later there is knocking on the door. Series. It started about a month ago. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty as hell. As I stumbled to the kitchen for a glass of water, I noticed a sliver of light coming from Ethan's room. The door was cracked open, and I could see his small silhouette framed against the window. "Ethan," I called softly, pushing the door open. "What are you doing up, buddy?" He didn't turn around. He just stood there, staring out into the darkness. "Ethan?" I tried again, a little louder this time. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Daddy, it's time," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. A shiver ran down my spine. "Time for what, bud?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to his chin. Within seconds, he was fast asleep. I checked my phone. 12 a.m. Weird, but kids do strange things sometimes, right? I tucked Ethan in and went back to bed, chalking it up to a random night terror or sleepwalking episode. The next night, I woke up again around 2 a.m. Call it parental instinct or just paranoia. But something made me check on Ethan. Sure enough, there he was at the window again. I checked my phone. 12 a.m. on the dot. This time, I didn't say anything. I just watched him from the doorway. He stood there, perfectly still, for exactly 5 minutes. Then, just as I was about to intervene, a sound pierced the silence that made my skin crawl. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp raps on our front door. Ethan didn't react. He just climbed back into bed like nothing had happened. With my heart pounding in my chest, I crept downstairs and peered through the peephole. The porch light illuminated an empty stoop. No one was there. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe some drunk teenager playing a prank. But a nagging feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. For the next week, the same thing happened every single night. Ethan at the window at 12 a.m., knocking at 2:17 a.m., no one at the door. I tried talking to Ethan about it during the day, but he had no memory of getting up at night. He just looked at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked if we could have pancakes for breakfast. I was starting to lose it. I wasn't sleeping. I couldn't focus at work. Every night, I'd sit on the stairs, watching Ethan's door, waiting for 12 a.m. with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. One night, about 10 days in, I decided to do something different. At 10 a.m., I quietly entered Ethan's room and stood next to his bed. As the clock ticked over to 12, his eyes snapped open. He sat up, but when he saw me, he froze. "Daddy," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here." "Why not, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Because," he said, his eyes darting to the window, "she's waiting." My mouth went dry. "Who's waiting, Ethan?" But before he could answer, the knocking started. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the other side of Ethan's bedroom window. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the eerie silence that followed, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "get away from the window, now." But my son didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something outside, something I couldn't see. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his small hand and pressed it against the glass. That's when I saw it, a hand on the other side of the window, mirroring Ethan's. Long, skeletal fingers with blackened nails. The skin was pale and waxy, like that of a corpse left too long in water. "Jesus Christ," I yelled, lunging forward to grab Ethan, but as soon as my fingers touched his shoulder, he let out a piercing scream that made me stagger backward. The hand outside the window vanished and Ethan collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing violently. I scooped him up, my mind reeling with panic. As I turned to rush him out of the room, my eyes caught something that made me freeze in my tracks. There, scratched into the window glass, were 5 words. I'm coming for him, John." A wave of dread washed over me. How the hell did it know my name? I ran downstairs with Ethan in my arms, fumbling for my phone to call 911. But as soon as I hit the bottom step, every light in the house flickered and died. In the pitch darkness, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound of nails dragging across wood, coming from every direction at once. "Daddy," Ethan whimpered, his small body trembling against mine. "She's inside now." I sprinted for the front door, my free hand outstretched in the darkness. But when I grabbed the doorknob, it was ice cold and slick with something wet. I yanked my hand back, feeling warm liquid dripping down my wrist. The coppery smell of blood filled my nostrils. "You can't leave, John," a voice whispered, so close I could feel fetid breath on my neck. It sounded like Marie, but wrong. Like her voice was being forced through a throat full of gravel. "We're a family again." "You're not, Marie," I choked out, backing away. "My wife is dead." A chilling laugh echoed through the house. "Dead? Oh, John, I'm so much more than dead." Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. I blinked, momentarily blinded. When my vision cleared, I saw her. Marie stood at the foot of the stairs, but it wasn't the Marie I remembered. Her skin was gray and bloated, her eyes sunken and filled with a sickly yellow light. Her once beautiful hair hung in wet, rotting clumps around her face. She wore the same dress we buried her in, now stained with dirt and God knows what else. "Marie?" I breathed, unable to believe what I was seeing. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "I've come to take our son home, John. It's time for Ethan to join me." Ethan squirmed in my arms, reaching out towards the thing that looked like his mother. "Mommy," he called, his voice a mixture of fear and longing. The creature's eyes locked onto Ethan, and she took a step forward. The floorboards creaked and squelched under her bare, mud-caked feet. "No," I shouted, clutching Ethan tighter. "You're not taking him." I turned and ran for the kitchen, my mind racing. Salt. I needed salt. Wasn't that supposed to work against spirits or something? As I fumbled through the cabinets, I could hear Marie's wet footsteps getting closer. The air grew cold, and the putrid stench of decay filled the room. "Oh, John," her voice sing-songed from just outside the kitchen. "You can't protect him forever. Ethan belongs with me now." I finally found the salt and turned around, ready to throw it. But what I saw made the container slip from my numb fingers. Marie stood in the doorway, but her body was wrong. Her limbs were elongated, joints bent at impossible angles. Her head lolled to one side, neck stretched and distorted. And behind her, writhing in the shadows, were dozens of arms, reaching, grasping. Ethan screamed. In that moment, as I stared into the abyss of that horrifying scene, I knew our lives would never be the same. Whatever was wearing Marie's face, whatever had been coming for my son night after night, it wasn't going to stop, and I had no idea how to fight it. The thing that wasn't Marie lurched forward, its grotesque limbs scrabbling across the kitchen floor. I backed away, clutching Ethan to my chest, my mind blank with terror. My back hit the kitchen counter, and I realized we were trapped. "Please," I begged, though I knew reasoning with this creature was futile. "Please, just leave us alone." The thing cocked its head at an unnatural angle, Marie's once beautiful features twisting into a mockery of confusion. "Leave you alone? But John, we're family. And family should be together ... forever." One of its many arms shot out impossibly fast, grabbing my ankle. I yelped as icy fingers dug into my flesh, the chill spreading up my leg like poison. Ethan whimpered in my arms, his small body shaking uncontrollably. In that moment of pure desperation, something inside me snapped. A surge of protective rage coursed through my veins, burning away the paralyzing fear. I wouldn't let this thing take my son. I couldn't. With a roar, I kicked out at the creature's face. My foot connected with a sickening squelch, and it reeled back, momentarily stunned. I seized the opportunity, charging past it towards the basement door. If we couldn't leave the house, maybe we could find a way to trap it. I slammed the basement door behind us and fumbled for the light switch. The dim bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Ethan clung to me, his face buried in my shoulder. "Daddy," he whispered, "I'm scared." "I know, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we're gonna be okay, I promise." That's when I saw it. In the corner of the basement, partially hidden behind some old boxes, was a door I'd never noticed before. It looked ancient, its wood warped and stained with age. From upstairs came the sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass. The creature was tearing the house apart looking for us. With no other choice, I approached the mysterious door. As I reached for the handle, Ethan suddenly spoke up. "That's where Mommy comes from," he said matter-of-factly. I froze. "What do you mean, Ethan?" He pointed at the door. "Every night at 12, that door opens. Mommy comes out and goes to my window. She says she misses us and wants us to come with her." But I was scared, so I didn't open the window. My mind reeled. How long had this been going on? And why to 12 a.m.? Then it hit me, to 12 a.m., February 12th, the day Marie died. Before I could process this revelation, the basement door exploded inward. The creature that wore Marie's face came slithering down the stairs, its body contorting in ways that defied physics. "Found you," it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. I grabbed the handle of the mysterious door and yanked it open. Beyond it was not the foundation of our house, but a swirling vortex of shadows and mist. The air that rushed out was frigid and smelled of decay. The creature let out an inhuman shriek. "No, you can't send me back. I won't go alone." It lunged at us, its numerous arms outstretched. In that split second, I made a decision that would haunt me forever. I set Ethan down and kissed his forehead. "I love you, buddy. Always remember that." Then, using all my strength, I shoved the creature towards the open door. But as it teetered on the threshold, one of its arms wrapped around my waist. I looked at Ethan, saw the terror and confusion in his eyes. "Run, Ethan, run upstairs and don't look back." The last thing I saw was my son's tear-streaked face as the creature and I fell through the doorway into the abyss beyond. I don't know how long I fell. Time seemed to have no meaning in that place of shadows and whispers. But eventually, I crashed onto what felt like solid ground. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my own basement. The old door had vanished, leaving only a blank wall. Sunlight streamed through the small windows. Morning had come. Painfully, I climbed the stairs, calling out for Ethan. I found him curled up on the living room couch, sleeping peacefully. When I woke him, he had no memory of the night's events. It's been a week since that terrible night. The scratches on Ethan's window are gone, as if they never existed. He no longer gets up at 12 a.m. To all appearances, our lives have returned to normal. But I know better. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from the basement. And in my dreams, I see Marie, the real Marie, reaching out to me from beyond a door I can never open. I don't know if the creature will find another way back. I don't know if it's truly gone or if it's just biding its time. All I know is that every night I check on Ethan at 12 a.m. And every night I pray that the knocking doesn't start again. It started innocently enough. Ethan, who's 7, made new friends in the neighborhood. As a single dad, seeing him smile again after everything we'd been through felt like a miracle. But you know what they say about things that seem too good to be true. The day it all began seemed normal. I was in the kitchen, trying to make dinner from the odds and ends in our fridge. Ethan was in the living room, cartoons playing in the background. "Dad?" Ethan's excited voice cut through the noise. "Can I go outside and play?" I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 6 p.m. later than I usually let him out. but the sun was still up. After everything we'd been through, I couldn't say no to that spark of enthusiasm. "Sure, buddy," I called back. "Just stay in the yard where I can see you, okay?" I heard the front door open and close, followed by Ethan's sneakers on the porch steps. As I chopped vegetables, I kept an eye on him through the kitchen window. He was kicking a soccer ball. His face lit up with joy I hadn't seen in weeks. That's when I first saw them. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, all around Ethan's age. They seemed to appear at the edge of our property, standing perfectly still and watching Ethan. I frowned, trying to place them. We knew most of the families in the neighborhood, but these kids didn't look familiar. Ethan noticed them too. He stopped mid-kick, the ball rolling away as he stared at the newcomers. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, all 3 kids walked towards Ethan in perfect unison. I tensed, my hand tightening on the knife I'd been using to chop carrots. But Ethan wasn't scared. In fact, he was smiling wider than ever. They talked for a while, their voices too low for me to hear. Then Ethan turned and waved at me through the window, pointing excitedly at his new friends. I waved back, forcing a smile even as my stomach twisted with dread. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I asked him about the kids. "Oh, they're really cool, Dad," he said, his eyes shining. "Can they come over to play tomorrow?" "Sure," I said, ruffling his hair. "What are their names?" Ethan's brow furrowed for a moment, as if trying to remember something important. Then his face cleared. "They're just my new friends," he said, shrugging. "You worrying too much, Dad." I laughed it off, but something about the interaction nagged at me. How could he not know their names? And why did he dodge the question so smoothly? As I turned off the light and left his room, I could have sworn I heard a faint giggle coming from somewhere outside. I peered out the window, but the street was empty, just my imagination, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next day, true to his word, Ethan's new friends showed up. They appeared at the edge of our yard, just like before, standing motionless until Ethan ran out to greet them. I watched from the porch, sipping my coffee and trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. "Hi there," I called out, putting on my friendliest dad voice. "I'm Ethan's dad. What are your names?" The 3 kids turned to look at me in perfect synchronization. Their faces were blank, expressionless. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the girl, a petite thing with pigtails, smiled. It was too wide, somehow, stretching almost to her ears. "We're Ethan's friends," she said, her voice oddly flat. "We like to play." Before I could respond, they were off running around the yard with Ethan. Their laughter echoed through the air, but something about it sounded off, like it was being played from a recording rather than coming from their mouths. As the days went by, Ethan's new friends became a constant presence in our lives. They'd show up at odd hours, always together, always silent until Ethan came out to play. I never caught their names, which should have been my first red flag. One evening, about a week after they first appeared, I was cooking dinner when I glanced out the kitchen window. The 3 kids were standing at the edge of our property, perfectly still, staring at our house. Their faces were blank, expressionless. I blinked, and they were gone. I tried to shake it off. Kids can be creepy sometimes, right? But deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to talk to Ethan about his new friends. "They seem different," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What do you guys do when you play?" Ethan shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Normal kid stuff, Dad, don't worry so much." But I did worry, especially when I started noticing other strange things around the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson next door complained that someone had been knocking on her door late at night, but when she answered, no one was there. Old Mr. Peterson swore he saw children sitting on his roof at 3 a.m. their legs dangling over the edge as they stared into his bedroom window. And then there were the animals. Neighborhood pets started going missing. First, it was the Thompsons' cat, then the Wilsons' dog. People blamed coyotes, but I couldn't shake the image of those three kids, standing motionless at the edge of the woods watching. I tried talking to other parents in the neighborhood, but no one seemed to know where these kids came from. It was like they'd just appeared one day, and everyone accepted it without question. Ethan, for his part, was spending more and more time with his new friends. He'd come home later and later, his clothes dirty and sometimes torn. When I asked what they'd been doing, he'd just shrug and say playing. One night, about 2 weeks after the kids first appeared, I woke up to the sound of Ethan's voice. I glanced at the clock, to 12 a.m. Frowning, I got out of bed and crept down the hall to his room. The door was ajar, and I could see Ethan silhouetted against his window. He was talking to someone, his voice low and urgent. "I can't," he was saying, "not yet. He'll notice if I leave now." There was a pause, as if he was listening to a response. Then I know, soon, I promise. We'll play soon." I pushed the door open. "Ethan," I called softly. "Who are you talking to, buddy?" He spun around, his eyes wide. For a split second, I could have sworn they flashed yellow in the moonlight. But then he blinked, and they were normal again. "No one, Dad," he said, climbing back into bed. "Just had a weird dream." I walked to the window and looked out. The street was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there watching, waiting. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There on the windowsill were 3 perfect handprints. Too small to be Ethan's, too small to be human. I went back to bed that night with a gnawing fear in my gut. Something was very wrong with Ethan's new friends, and I was starting to suspect that whatever it was spreading to my son. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what. I just hoped it wasn't already too late. I started by calling the school. Surely, if these kids lived in the neighborhood, they'd be enrolled there. But when I asked about 3 new students, 2 boys and a girl, the secretary seemed confused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but we haven't had any new enrollments in the past month," she said. "Are you sure these children are school-aged?" I thanked her and hung up. My Annie's growing. If they weren't in school, where were they coming from? Where were their parents? I decided to do some digging online. I searched for recent news about children in our area, hoping to find anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I came across an article that made my stomach twist with dread. Local children still missing after 3 months. The article, dated just over 2 years ago, detailed the disappearance of 3 children from a nearby town. 2 boys and a girl, all around 7 years old. The same ages as Ethan's new friends. The police had found no leads, and the case had gone cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I needed more information. That afternoon, when Ethan came home from school, I was waiting for him on the porch. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I thought maybe we could go to the park today. Just the 2 of us." Ethan's face fell. "But Dad," I told my friends I'd play with them. "Your friends can wait one day," I said, more firmly than I intended. "Come on, it'll be fun." For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. A strange look passed over his face, almost like anger, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Then he shrugged. "Okay, I guess." As we walked to the park, I tried to engage Ethan in conversation, hoping to glean some information about his mysterious friends. But every time I brought them up, he'd change the subject or give vague, non-committal answers. We were almost at the park when Ethan suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes were fixed on something across the street. I followed his gaze, and a wave of icy fear washed over me. There they were, the three children standing perfectly still on the sidewalk, staring at us. Their faces were expressionless, but there was something accusing in their stance, as if we'd broken some unspoken rule by going to the park without them. "Ethan," I said softly, gripping his shoulder, "do you know those kids' names?" He didn't answer. He was trembling slightly under my hand, his eyes still locked on his friend's. "Ethan," I repeated, more urgently. "Answer me, buddy. Do you know their names?" Slowly, he turned to look at me. For a second, just a split second, his eyes seemed to glow with a sickly yellow light. Then he blinked, and they were normal again. "They don't have names, Dad," he said, his voice eerily calm. "They don't need them." A chill ran down my spine. I looked back across the street, but the children were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. That night, I lay awake for hours, mulling over everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in danger, that these children were something far more sinister than they appeared. But what could I do? Who would believe me if I told them? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to the sound of giggling. High-pitched, childlike laughter that seemed to be coming from right outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The digital clock on my nightstand read to 12 a.m. The giggling continued, punctuated by the sound of small feet pattering around the house. Cautiously, I got out of bed and crept to the window. The street outside was dark and empty, but I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows, quick, darting shapes that were there and gone in an instant. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I stood frozen, unsure what to do. Should I answer? Should I wake Ethan? Before I could decide, I heard the creak of a door opening down the hall. Ethan's door. I rushed out of my room just in time to see Ethan disappearing down the stairs. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost gliding down each step. "Ethan," I called out, but he didn't respond. It was like he couldn't hear me. I followed him down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Ethan was standing in front of the front door, his hand on the doorknob. "Ethan, stop," I said, reaching for him. But just as my fingers brushed his shoulder, he pulled the door open. There was nothing there, no creepy children, no mysterious visitors. Just the empty night, a cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees lining our street. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring out into the darkness. Then, slowly, he turned to look at me. His eyes were wide and unfocused, as if he wasn't fully awake. "They're waiting for me, Dad," he said, his voice distant and dreamy. "They want me to come play." I scooped him up in my arms, ignoring his weak protests, and slammed the door shut. As I carried him back upstairs, I could have sworn I heard that high-pitched giggling again, fading away into the night. The next morning, Ethan had no memory of what had happened. When I asked him about it over breakfast, he just looked at me blankly. "I don't sleepwalk, Dad," he said, sounding more like his old self than he had in days. "You must have been dreaming. Maybe I had been. Maybe this was all just my overactive imagination, fueled by stress and lack of sleep." But as I watched Ethan head off to school, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That afternoon, I decided to do some more investigating. While Ethan was at school, I walked around the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking if anyone knew anything about the 3 strange children. Most of my neighbors looked at me like I was crazy. They hadn't seen any new kids in the area. They said maybe I was mistaking them for the Jensen twins and their cousin who sometimes visited. But old Mrs. Abernathy, who lived at the end of our street, had a different story. "Oh, those children," she said, her rheumy eyes narrowing. "I've seen them, yes, late at night, wandering the streets. They're not right, those ones. Not right at all. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning in. She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear, then beckoned me closer. "They move wrong," she whispered, "like puppets on strings, and their eyes glow in the dark like animals." A chill ran down my spine. "Have you told anyone else about this?" Mrs. Abernathy cackled, a harsh, humorless sound. "Who'd believe an old woman like me? They'd say I'm senile, seeing things. But I know what I saw. Those aren't children, Mr. Thompson. There's something else, something wicked." As she spoke, a memory surfaced, something I'd read in that article about the missing children. The last person to see them alive had reported something strange. Their eyes, the witness had said. For a moment, I could have sworn their eyes were glowing. I thanked Mrs. Abernathy and left, my mind reeling. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the image of those 3 children, moving like puppets, their eyes glowing in the dark. When I got home, Ethan was already there, playing in the backyard with his friends. I watched them from the kitchen window, trying to see what Mrs. Abernathy had described. At first, everything seemed normal. They were just kids running around laughing. But then I saw it. The way they moved, it was subtle, but undeniably strange. Their joints seemed to bend at odd angles, their movements too fluid, too precise. And when they laughed, their mouths opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. I must have made a sound because suddenly all 3 of them stopped and turned to look at me. Their eyes met mine through the window, and in that moment, I knew. These weren't children. They weren't human at all. As if reading my thoughts, they smiled in unison. Those 2 wide smiles, stretching almost to their ears. Then, as one, they turned back to Ethan and resumed playing as if nothing had happened. I wanted to run out there to grab Ethan and take him far away from those things, but something stopped me. A paralyzing fear that if I interfered, if I showed that I knew the truth, something terrible would happen. So I stood there watching helplessly as my son played with monsters wearing the skins of children. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of me. I wasn't much of a drinker, hadn't touched the stuff since Marie died, but tonight I needed something to steady my nerves. As I poured myself a second glass, I heard it again. That soft, high-pitched giggling, coming from somewhere outside. I got up, my legs unsteady, and went to the window. There they were, standing at the edge of our property. The 3 children, their eyes glowing yellow in the darkness. They were looking up at Ethan's window, those unnatural smiles plastered across their faces. As I watched, frozen in horror, they began to change. Their bodies elongated, limbs stretching to impossible lengths. Their faces melted and reformed, becoming something inhuman, something nightmarish. Then, as one, they turned to look at me. Their smiles widened even further, revealing rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. I stumbled back from the window, knocking over my chair in my haste. By the time I looked again, they were gone. But their laughter lingered, echoing through the night like a promise that this was far from over. As I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, I realized something that chilled me to my core. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted with Ethan, I was in way over my head. And I had no idea how to protect my son from something I couldn't even begin to understand. The clock on the wall ticked over to 2:12 a.m., and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the night. Knock, knock, knock. The game, it seemed, was just beginning. I knew I needed help, but who could I turn to? The police, they'd think I was crazy. A priest? I wasn't even sure if this was a religious thing. In desperation, I even considered reaching out to one of those paranormal investigation shows, but the thought of exposing Ethan to that kind of scrutiny held me back. In the end, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my sister, Karen. Karen had always been the pragmatic one in our family. Where I was prone to flights of fancy, she was grounded, logical. I hoped that her level-headedness might help me see something I was missing. She arrived the next afternoon, her sensible sedan pulling into our driveway just as Ethan was getting home from school. As always, his 3 friends were with him. Jesus, John, Karen said as she got out of the car, her eyes fixed on the children. You weren't kidding about them being creepy. I followed her gaze. The 3 of them were standing perfectly still at the edge of our yard, their eyes locked on Karen. Their faces were expressionless, but there was something threatening in their stance. Ethan, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Come say hi to your Aunt Karen. Ethan turned to look at us, and for a moment, I saw confusion flicker across his face, as if he didn't recognize us. Then he blinked, and a smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes. Hi, Aunt Karen, he said, his voice oddly flat. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the house, his friends following close behind. Karen watched them go, her brow furrowed. Okay, she said slowly, I see what you mean. That was ... unsettling. Over dinner that night, I filled Karen in on everything that had been happening. The strange behavior, the nightly disturbances, the transformations I'd witnessed. To her credit, she listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. Have you considered that Ethan might need professional help? She asked gently when I'd finished. I shook my head vehemently. It's not Ethan, I insisted. It's them. They're doing something to him. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a high-pitched giggle echoed through the house. We both froze, eyes darting to the stairs leading up to the 2nd floor. Was that? Karen whispered. I nodded grimly. They're here. We crept up the stairs, the giggles growing louder as we approached Ethan's room. The door was closed, but I could see lights spilling out from underneath. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. Ethan was sitting on his bed, surrounded by his 3 friends. They were playing some kind of game, their hands moving in complex patterns as they chanted in a language I didn't recognize. As we entered, they all turned to look at us in perfect unison. Ethan, I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. It's time for your friends to go home. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, Ethan's friends stood up. They moved with that unnatural fluidity I'd noticed before, their joints bending at impossible angles. We'll see you soon, Ethan, the girl said, her voice a chorus of whispers. Remember what we talked about. Then they were gone, slipping past Karen and me as if we weren't even there. I heard the front door open and close, and then silence. Ethan blinked, looking around as if he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. Dad, he said, his voice small and confused. What's going on? I rushed to him, pulling him into a tight hug. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then I felt him stiffen in my arms, and when I pulled back, his eyes were that sickly yellow color again. You shouldn't interfere, Dad, he said, his voice once again that eerie monotone. They don't like it when you interfere. I stumbled back, bumping into Karen, who let out a small gasp. By the time I looked at Ethan again, his eyes were back to normal. He was staring at us, confusion written all over his face. I think, Karen said slowly, we need to get Ethan out of this house. Now. I couldn't have agreed more. We quickly packed a bag for Ethan, telling him we were going on an impromptu vacation. He seemed excited at first, but as we were walking out to the car, he suddenly stopped. We can't leave, he said, his voice trembling. They won't let us. As if on cue, the streetlights began to flicker. In the distance, I could hear that high-pitched giggling again, growing louder by the second. Get in the car, I said, ushering Ethan into the back seat. Karen, drive. Karen didn't need to be told twice. She gunned the engine, and we peeled out of the driveway. As we turned onto the main road, I looked back. There, In the middle of the street stood Ethan's three friends. They were smiling those two wide smiles, their eyes glowing yellow in the darkness. As we sped away into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever these things were, they weren't going to let Ethan go without a fight. And I had a sinking feeling that our desperate flight was playing right into their hands. We drove through the night, putting as much distance between us and our town as possible. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd escaped. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan began to stir. He sat up, looking around with wide, panicked eyes. "We have to go back," he said, his voice urgent. "They're calling me. We have to go back." Before we could react, he'd unbuckled his seatbelt and was trying to open the car door. Karen swerved, nearly running off the road as she tried to keep control of the car. "Ethan, stop," I yelled, reaching back to grab him. But as my hand touched his arm, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I recoiled, my hand burning as if I'd touched a live wire. Ethan turned to look at me, and my heart sank. His eyes were glowing that sickly yellow color, his face twisted into an expression of rage I'd never seen before. "You can't keep me from them," he snarled, his voice a mixture of his own and something older, something inhuman. "I belong to them now." Suddenly, the car filled with that high-pitched giggling. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder and louder until it was all we could hear. Karen slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop on the empty highway. And there they were, Ethan's friends, standing in the middle of the road in front of us. They shouldn't have been there. We'd driven for hours, put hundreds of miles between us and them. But somehow, impossibly, they were here. As we watched in horror, they began to change. Their bodies elongated, twisting into impossible shapes. Their faces melted and reformed, becoming grotesque parodies of childlike features. And their eyes, God, their eyes were blazing with that terrible yellow light. Ethan let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "They're here," he said, his voice filled with a terrible joy. "They've come for me." Before I could stop him, he'd thrown open the car door and was running towards those monstrous creatures. I scrambled out after him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan," I screamed, "Ethan, come back." But he didn't even look back. He ran straight into the arms of those things, and as they enveloped him, I saw his body begin to twist and change, mirroring their monstrous forms. I tried to run to him, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, forced to watch as my son was transformed into something inhuman, something terrifying. Karen was beside me now, her face pale with shock. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling. What are they doing to him?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The transformation seemed to last an eternity, but it must have been only moments. When it was over, Ethan stood before us, but he wasn't Ethan anymore. His body was elongated, his limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. His face was a twisted mockery of itself, with that same terrible grin stretching from ear to ear, and his eyes were that sickly yellow, glowing with an inner light that was both beautiful and horrifying. "Oh, Daddy," Ethan said, his voice a chorus of whispers. "Don't you want to play with us?" I felt something break inside me then. Some last vestige of denial, of hope that this was all some terrible nightmare. I knew now with terrible certainty that my son was gone, and in his place was something ancient, something hungry. But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. "Ethan," I said, my voice hoarse. "Ethan, if you're in there, please, come back to me. We can fight this. We can." I was cut off by a burst of that terrible laughter. It came from all four of them now, a cacophony of childlike giggles that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Fight," Ethan said, cocking his head at an impossible angle. "Oh, Daddy, we don't want to fight. We want to play. Forever and ever." He took a step towards us, his movements jerky and unnatural. The other three flanked him, their grins widening impossibly. "Join us, Daddy," Ethan said, reaching out a hand that was more claw than human. "We have so much to show you." I felt Corinne tugging at my arm, heard her voice urging me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave Ethan, even if Ethan wasn't really Ethan anymore. That's when I remembered the article, the missing children from years ago. The witness who'd seen their eyes glow, and suddenly I understood. These things, whatever they were, they didn't just take children. They became them, used their memories, their faces, to lure in more victims. And now they had Ethan. My son was just another mask for them to wear. The realization filled me with a rage I'd never felt before. A protective fury that burned away my fear, my hesitation. "No," I growled, taking a step forward. "You can't have him. You can't have any of them." The creatures paused, their grins faltering for just a moment. I pressed on, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You don't belong here," I said. "This isn't your world. These aren't your bodies to take. Go back to whatever hell you came from and leave our children alone." For a moment, just a moment, I saw something flicker in Ethan's eyes. A spark of recognition of the boy he used to be. And in that instant, I knew what I had to do. I lunged forward, wrapping my arms around Ethan's twisted form. I held on tight even as his two long limbs thrashed, and his claws dug into my back. "I love you, Ethan," I whispered fiercely. "I love you, and I'm not letting you go. Come back to me, come back." I felt something shift then. A tremor ran through Ethan's body, and suddenly he was screaming. Not the inhuman shriek of before, but the terrified cry of a little boy lost in a nightmare. The other creatures howled in rage, their forms twisting and writhing as they tried to pull Ethan away from me. But I held on, my love for my son burning brighter than their ancient hunger. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in that impossible embrace. But slowly, I felt Ethan's body begin to change. His limbs shortening, his skin smoothing out until finally, blessedly, I was holding my son again. My real son. The other creatures let out one final, ear-splitting shriek. Their forms seemed to collapse in on themselves, twisting and folding until they were nothing more than wisps of shadow. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, they were gone. Ethan sagged in my arms, unconscious but breathing. I sank to my knees, cradling him close, tears streaming down my face. Corinne was there then, her arms around both of us. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over, John, you did it." But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. Those things, whatever they were still out there, waiting, watching, and someday they might come back. As we drove home, Ethan sleeping peacefully in the back seat, I made a silent vow. I would be ready. I would protect my son, and any other child I could, from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. As I write this, it's 2:11 a.m. In 1 minute, I'll make my nightly rounds, checking the locks, looking in on Ethan.